Hi, everybody. This is a recording for Virtual MathPsych ICCM and on 2024. I'm Peter Twom, and the talk is going to be about revisiting the role of operational definitions in psychological science. So this is going to be kind of a high-level talk about something that's really actually a core component of a lot of psychological methods, and that's the idea of operational definitions. Before I dive in, I actually want to talk about another field. And physics and has kind of been part of psychological science. Right? There's all this nice stuff about measurements in physics that we rightfully can be jealous of. And for a long time, psychology has kind of tried to mimic the approaches of other fields. But today, I want to talk about a different field that we might seek to replicate, right? And that field is metrology. Right? And in metrology, a lot of times they'll define particular constructs, so something like mass or a particular unit, like the kilogram, in terms of reference to a common object, right? So in terms of weight, for a long time, up until relatively recently, a kilogram was defined as the weight of this single object, right? This little alloy of platinum and iridium that was stored in the basements of the Bureau of Weights and Measures under extreme conditions where it wasn't going to change in mass over time. And as a result, this definition of a kilogram was relatively reliable, it was replicable, it was consistent, and was nearly immutable, right? So this thing changed by a couple micrograms over the course of several hundred years. And every scale in the world eventually was directly or indirectly calibrated to that little cylinder of platinum and iridium, right? And that meant that everybody who measured mass had some degree of agreement, within some amount of noise, on how much something weighed, at least when it was measured. And this is something that we kind of try to replicate in psychology, right? We try to define our constructs, the stuff that we want to measure, the stuff that we want to study in terms of a measurement process, right? So in terms of how this thing is related to the scale that we put it on, right? And we want to calibrate the scale to something common. The problem is that we don't have an international prototype, right? We don't have an international prototype of intelligence or memory or bias or drift or something like this. So every time we measure one of these properties, we're getting a different result. And we don't have any way to kind of compare the results that different people are getting. And second, most of the things we want to study in psychology are latent constructs. They're not kind of physical properties of the world, but they're properties that we think are governing behavior, but things that we can't necessarily directly observe. And that comes with an accompanying problem, which is, well, when something's hidden, there are a lot of ways to try to measure it, right? Whether that's a particular behavior or a self-report scale, or whether we're trying to directly measure neural activity, or even if we're measuring individual neurons and how they're interacting. There are lots of different ways to get at a theoretical construct. And when we have lots of different measures, they might not all converge on the same measurement, right? So there's this problem, even in metrology, of what they call a coastline paradox, which is basically the size of the ruler that you use to measure the length of a coastline, for instance, can determine the outcome that you get, right? So if you measure it with a relatively small ruler, right? So 66 pixels, this is just a line on the screen, right? Then the total length that you're going to get for this line is actually going to be a little over 1200 pixels. But if you measure it with a coarser ruler, sort of a less fine-grained measure, then actually you're going to get a totally different result for how long this thing is. And there's a parallel problem in psychology, right? If we have one measure that's really sensitive at a certain part of the scale and relatively coarse at another part of the scale, and one measure that's sensitive at a different part of the scale, then linear changes in the length of something, right, or a fixed difference between two people, for instance, and let's say memory, right, is going to result in different apparent differences based on the measure that you use to assess them, right? And so there's this problem that, well, if we have a whole bunch of different measures, we have to figure out, well, how is the construct that we're measuring mapping onto the measure, the latent construct we're trying to study. And this gets at, I think, an underlying problem here, which is that the apparent kind of lack of replicability, lack of reliability, lack of predictive validity that we get from often our operationally defined constructs might not be ideal. And in fact, if you have an operational definition, and you assume that operational definition is measuring something without error, you're actually going to get inflated type 1 errors. You're going to get things like failures to replicate. You're going to get findings that aren't actually real. You're going to get a lot of these problems that seem to be showing up in psychology right now. So a lot of these crises have quite a bit to do with operational definitions and the way that we define our theoretical constructs. So what are the properties of operational definition? Where are these problems coming from in the first place? I want to say that there are at least four kind of general characteristics of operational definitions, right? Or at least assumptions that operational definitions make. One is that there's kind of a true value for any combination of a person and measure, right? And if we all follow the same procedure, we're all going to get the same result within some amount of error. Second is independence, right? If we measure one person's construct and another person's construct, those two things shouldn't interact with one another, right? So when I measure one person's memory and another person's memory, I can kind of put those in context, I can compare them, but the raw values shouldn't affect. Third, I should be able to get the same result by running the same procedure on the same person, right? So this whole idea of reliability. So, well, within some constraints provided by noise, if I carry out the same process, I should be able to get the same measurement, the same quantity for theoretical construct. And lastly, kind of implicit in the idea of operational measurement is that operational definition is that you follow a fixed procedure, right? This is the procedure that you get in order to get your measurement of whatever your construct is. But there's a lot in the way that we practice psychology, we actually practice measurement, that actually rubs up against these ideas, these assumptions of operational definitions. For those of you who are familiar with Bayesian statistics, which I imagine are most of you, the idea of priors actually results in subjective estimates, right? So when we estimate a latent value, we're integrating not only the data that we have, but also what we think going into the problem, right? So priors actually make this not objective, they make it subjective. And there are a lot of reasons to do that, but it is breaking kind of the assumptions of operational definition. Likewise, so the quantum models that we work with sometimes actually suggest that, well, the measurement that you get is actually constructed on the fly, right? It's not an objective measurement of the thing that's actually there, but it's actually some interaction between the measurement process and the thing that you're measuring that actually creates the result, right? So we're kind of breaking this assumption of objectivity. Oftentimes we're using hierarchical constraints now. So when we're comparing two groups, oftentimes we'll say, well, these people are coming from, they each have an individual level parameter, but they're coming from some group level distribution. Especially when we do that on a Bayesian way, what we're actually doing is we're using shrinkage, which means that the group level mean is impacting your estimates of the individual level parameter, right? Which means that, well, my measurement for person A and my measurement for person B aren't entirely independent anymore. They actually influence one another, right? And that has some desirable properties, but it's breaking this assumption of independence. Likewise, we have order effects, and each time we measure somebody's behavior, we implement the same task, people might be taking different strategies to approach that task, right? So when we elicit order effects, and when we elicit different use of different strategies in different contexts, we're actually not having the same kind of repeatable measurement procedure because what's happening under the hood is not the same at the different measurement type points, right? So our operational definition assumption of repeatability is also broken. And then you can imagine also, adaptive designs are getting increasingly popular, right? Because they allow you to narrow in on somebody's particular level of trait, right? So even standardized tests are starting to do this because it allows you to get more precise and better estimates of people's latent abilities, right? Whatever trait you're trying to measure. So our adaptive designs are actually violating this assumption of fixed procedure, right? So MathPsych is breaking all the rules. These are really kind of standard stuff that we're doing all the time in the field right now. And we're really running counter to the assumptions of operational definitions. But the question is basically, well, is that a bad thing? It turns out that the consequences of doing a lot of these things are positive, right? So we get better prediction of human behavior, right? So if we fit a model to a set of data, right? So we did this with the IIT, for instance, we can actually predict different outcomes much better with the model parameters than we can with some behavior. We get better estimation of latent processes and constructs, right? So if we're running adaptive design optimization, or if we're using model parameters to assess performance, those things tend to actually be much more reliable if you use the model parameters or if you use the adaptive design than if you just kind of apply the same thing to everybody and use some sort of stuff. But we also account better for different sources of error, right? There are different sources, there are individual level variability, and there's also trial level variability. And there's also group level variability. There's variability between groups of people, right? And building all that into our models, it actually allows us to better estimate how each person is doing and better estimate each person's latent parameters. We can also put together different measures of the same underlying construct. When we use things like joint models, when we use things like covariance structures, we can actually get a more coherent theoretical picture of like what's happening across task A, measure A, B, measure C, measure D, as a function of some common set of latent variables or latent constructs. And of course, we get more coherent explanation of the latent system, right? So an operational definition, using one thing to kind of summarize everything that's going on with memory, for instance, is kind of silly, right? Memory is a system. It's not just one thing that we're doing. And the whole system that produces the measurement that we observe the better we explain that, the better we kind of have a good explanatory theory of how that thing works. And Paul Du and some other people started, I think, a really interesting dialogue about this when they talked about latent constructs and the way that they're composite, they're hierarchical, and they can actually vary from time to time point. I'm actually going to take this a step further and say, well, there's something better than operational definitions out there. Right? If we look at operational definitions, really what it is it's some summary of observed data on one individual task. What most of us in MathPsych are doing are taking that observed data and describing it in terms of some set of latent variables, right? Maybe that's drift and threshold and non-decision time, or maybe that's forgetting rate, or maybe that's some sort of an attention variable, or something like this, right? But that still only describes one task, right? It describes the rate of evidence accumulation on this task, describes rate of evidence accumulation on this task, rate of evidence accumulation on this task. And what we kind of need to do in order to stitch all that together is build these kind of factor structures, theoretical structures that say, well, this is how it works on this task, this is how it works on this task, and this is how it works on this task. And all three of these latent variables inform our understanding of accumulation rate or memory capacity or whatever it is we're trying to measure. And I think of these as relational or computational evidence, right? They relate patterns of behavior across different tasks and different measures in terms of some common latent construct. So there are a couple limitations to this, right? One is, well, what tasks do we use? There's a whole bunch of different tasks that you can use to measure different latent constructs, and identifying how behavior is related to latent constructs is of course a natural challenge in mathematics psychology. The upside is that some of this can be automated, right? So Dirk Wolff and Ruud Mata are using this approach to actually use embeddings to detect basically self-report scales that measure the same things, right? This idea of jingle and jangle fallacies, right? So there are a whole bunch of different scales that all measure depression. There are a whole bunch of different scales that all measure leadership. Just nobody's connected those things. But if we can start to say, well, are they asking the same questions? Are they using the same words? Well, they might be measuring something that's pretty similar. Second problem is, well, what models do we use, right? We have models for a lot of tasks, but there's still a lot of tasks for which we don't have models. And so we need kind of an exploratory way to start to develop models of new tasks. We need to be able to automate this. So one way to do this is actually use things like autoencoders, right? Which actually takes a set of neural behavior or self-report data and compresses it down to a set of latent dimensions and then tries to reproduce the data, right? When you do this, you can guarantee that these latent dimensions are enough to reproduce this data to within whatever your reproduction accuracy. So there are entire talks on this in in-person MathPsych, so I'll agree that those don't want to go into this too much now. But there's also limits to our theory, right? The third problem is that, well, we could run into parallels of the coastline paradox, right? It's actually possible that some of the constructs we seek to measure, so something like memory, the closer you zoom in, the more complex it looks, right? And that's a big problem because no matter how far we zoom in, we still have increasing complexity. And so the models have to increase in complexity as well as we get closer and closer. And so what we're describing and who we're describing it to, we might have to work at kind of different levels, right? And if these things exhibit fractal-like properties, then we might be in big trouble in terms of developing complete theoretical. Another problem is dealing with the effect of measurement, right? So we can kind of start to develop theories of these things, right? So the quantum cognition program has been big in this area, just trying to explain measurement as an interaction between the thing that you're having people do, right? Your elicitation procedure and the person themselves. And that's not just your eliciting measurement, but you're actually interacting between those people, right? Adaptive design optimization does the same thing, right? What the person does affects what the experiment does. What the experiment does affects what the person does. And that also interacts with the latent system. And the last kind of most challenging one is, well, do our latent constructs actually exist? Right? So there's this question of, well, if we hypothesize that there's a particular latent construct, right, like working memory capacity, that makes it easy to talk about. And that has a lot of virtues in terms of, well, it relates to these different measurements that we have. It's coherent. It allows us to communicate about this thing. But working memory capacity in and of itself might not exist in kind of the real sense, right? There might just not just be one part of the brain that corresponds to working memory capacity. And so these kinds of theoretical hurdles are really important to identify. So let me put this all together. I don't have solutions to all these problems. In fact, I've probably raised more problems than I've actually solved in this talk. But one thing I think is clear is that operational definitions kind of aren't sufficient for a mature psychological science, right? A psychological science that's rich in theory and provides good descriptions, explanations of psychological systems have to go beyond operational definitions. And one way to start to do that is this idea of relational definitions, right? These kind of hierarchically structured things where multiple tasks are quantified in terms of latent variables, and those latent variables are related across multiple tasks. Of course, operational definitions might still be useful in exploratory settings, right, where a construct isn't clear or something like that. But I think in many cases, they've kind of outlived their usefulness. I want to wrap by saying one thing that I kind of hope for the field, and one thing that I actually do envy physics about, is that they actually motivate the invention of new statistical and mathematical approaches based on the stuff that they're trying to study, right? So when you're dealing with subatomic particles, right, you need quantum probability theory in order to explain their behavior. When you're dealing with things that happen in continuous world, when you're dealing with gravity, when you're dealing with a lot of these kinds of things, you need approaches like calculus, right? And my hope is that in order to rise to kind of occasions and develop these meaningful theories, that psychology maybe someday will motivate its own branches of math that are suited to our kinds of problems and problems that we solve. So I'll wrap up there. Hopefully I'll see some of you during the virtual MathPsych. I look forward to it.